Hey guys, it's me again. I'm re-recording this video because my video kind of just froze in the middle of the last one. So hopefully it doesn't do that this time. Okay, this is the homework number 1 for macroeconomics. I've done both questions here. I haven't included the graphs. I don't think it's particularly necessary, but you can, I suppose, if you want to. Yeah, well, I think we better get started then. So let's read through the first question. Starting from the medium run equilibrium, explain the response of the economy to a deflationary shock, one that reduces inflation expectations. Make sure your explanation follows the timeline available on Moodle. Here it is. In addition to describing parts of a time of output, inflation and interest rates, at each stage describe carefully what happens in the labour market and the goods market. How could fiscal policy instead of monetary policy be used to respond to the shock? Right, well, let's take a look at this. First of all, let's look at the timeline here. Okay, so we're seeing an interest rate, a shock happen, expectations of inflation change. We're looking at the labour market here. Okay, then we're looking, now the economy is essentially on the price, the Phillips curve and the interest savings curve. Then we have the central bank's decisions. Okay, now I'm going to go through sort of my timeline of it. Again, you can write this differently. It's more of an open question, so it's going to have a lot more depth to it. So again, take it your own way. But still, first of all, we need to establish what the medium run equilibrium is. Medium run equilibrium is when inflation is currently staying. It's essentially, we're assuming inflation is staying at its current level. So if I have inflation in the last period, if I have inflation in this period of 4%, I'm expecting inflation to be 4% in the next period, essentially. But in this case, we've adjusted. Okay, well, actually, yeah. Okay, so that's expected inflation, and then output we should expect to stay the same as well. Now, when a deflationary shock happens, our expected inflation changes to the level of deflation we currently are at. So if we have a level of deflation of about -5%, it's going to be -5% next time. Okay. So what's going to happen is the price level is going to decrease over that time. Okay, because there's deflation. Now, what this does is it raises the real wage rate, because real wage is determined by wage over the price level. So if the price level below is going to drop, the real wage is going to expand. So the supply of labour is increased, okay, and the wage setting curve is going to go upwards. Well, yeah, essentially go up. Yeah, while more people demand labour and the real wage increases. Yeah. So goods production is also going to slow down at the same time, though, because in a deflationary shock, you have businesses who don't have many customers, because most people are saving during deflationary shocks, because your money is worth more tomorrow, right? So if your money is worth more tomorrow, you're not going to spend it today. So businesses have reduced basically demand for their services, so they have to reduce the production available to them. Now, given the surplus demand for employment, okay, firms can readjust by lowering the nominal wage. So lowering the nominal wage means they have to pay for themselves functionally less, and they're also going to balance out the WSPS curves by essentially lowering back down the wage to match the price level. No, that's not correct. They're going to lower the real wage back down to the price setting curve, which they determine. Okay. So then once, oh God, sorry, I'm getting out of breath. It's nearly 9 o'clock. I kind of want to have dinner soon, so do excuse me. So firms are also going to reduce their markup, because if they reduce their prices, that's going to make them more competitively advantageous, especially in a deflationary economy. Because in a deflationary economy, people aren't going to go out to buy things if they're a higher price or even the same price. They're going to go out to buy things if they're a lower price. So they're going to lower their prices, lower their markup to make themselves more competitive. Okay. Now, talking about the central bank now, the central bank wants to get inflation and output back on track. So let's take a look at what you're being given here. This is an aggregate demand shock. Now, this is sort of the opposite of what's sort of happening. Okay. We're having sort of a negative demand shock in the deflationary scenario. So imagine all this kind of in reverse, okay? So essentially what's happening is that PC curves are dropping. So for every given output level, the inflation rate is lower. What's also true is that IS curves are shifting to the left. So for every given interest rate, output is dropping, essentially. So output is lower at every given interest rate because of the deflation, okay? Now, the central bank can counteract this, essentially, by pushing out onto a further MR curve, okay, something over here. Because we've got a family of PC curves, we can actually do this, okay? So the monetary policy curve is going to be out here, okay? And what it's going to do is going to suggest that, okay, out here, we've got, perhaps at this level, we've got a level of output and a level of inflation which are preferable for us. So we're going to pick that along our PC curve, okay? Then this also corresponds to a reduction in the interest rate, okay? So for example, if we're here, we're going to go up here, and we'll see the interest rate gets reduced in order to counteract this, okay? So what the central bank is going to do is it's going to shift down its interest rate in order to essentially bring inflation and bring output back up to the previous level. So what this also going to do is it's going to allow businesses to increase their markup back to the previous level. It's going to allow the real wage to drop, which is maybe going to also increase nominal wages to counteract it. And yeah, firms can now borrow more to increase their output, and so can individuals. So the economy sort of slowly bounces back. Fiscal policy can also be used here, but it's somewhat difficult. Okay, fiscal policy you could use here would be something like a tax cut, where individuals and firms get more money to essentially work with. But the problem with using fiscal policy here is that if you take away from taxation revenue for the government, okay, it's going to be harder for the government to fund a lot of projects. Something like, I don't know, for example, putting more money into the NHS, okay? It's going to be much more difficult for a government to work on that kind of project if they're cutting taxes, okay? So that makes it a lot more difficult. Okay, hopefully that was clear, all right? Now let's look at question 2. Describe how monetary and fiscal policy affect output. Please don't draw diagrams, just explain it in words. So here's the words. So I think we all know how monetary and fiscal policy sort of works, so I'll go quickly over this. Monetary policy affects output by changing the interest rate, making it easier or harder to borrow. That makes it essentially more costly or cheaper to use money, and therefore more costly or more cheaper to expand output or not, essentially. And then when it comes to fiscal policy, we're talking mostly through taxation, okay? So taxation is used to expand what individuals have or contract what individuals have, and then take that surplus money to the government to use on other stuff, okay? It essentially, it's a direct way of sort of making sure that you have enough money that you currently have got to work with. And if you don't have enough money at the moment, the tax rate might be reduced, so it makes it a bit easier on you. If if deflation is happening, the tax rate might be lowered just to give you a bit more breathing room. Okay. Now, when we talk about give 2 reasons based on the material covered course why either fiscal policy or monetary policy might have no effect on output, I'm going over this. Now, this is brought up in week 5 in expectations. So I've used this case where there is, the inflation is, we're assuming inflation is essentially static, is it? Yeah. Where there is static inflation in the economy. So when inflation is static, and we can see this in the examples in week 5, expectations and effectiveness of policy, basically inflation has a mean of 0. So its sort of expected rate is 0, right? So if we look at a Phillips curve in this, it's going to end up, the Phillips curve is just going to be related to output gap instead. Hold on. Can say that it has a, sorry, I'm editing this as I go, mean of 0. So is only reliant on the output gap. Yeah. So because, okay, so taking the Phillips curve here, okay, if I now change inflation within the Phillips curve, that's not going to do anything because I'm not going to, hold on, let me just check this. Yeah, essentially, because my expected inflation is zero, essentially. So if I change my inflation, that's not going to do anything in the Phillips curve. So I'm not going to have multiple Phillips curves to base a monetary policy rule on, essentially. So, because inflation is essentially unaffected, firms don't change their production, and the firms don't change their behavior, because essentially just inflation is static. So no one's going to change what they're going to do. When we look at fiscal policy, something that's let me give myself a bit of time here. Yeah. In fiscal policy, one change that would make no effect would be a tax rate decrease when the marginal propensity to consume is zero. Okay? If your marginal propensity to consume is completely zero, for example, in a extreme deflationary sort of spiral, okay, you're not going to spend money. Okay? So decreasing my tax rate is not going to have any effect, because if I have that extra money, I'm not going to spend it. Okay? Because functionally, if I have that money, I'm going to keep it for myself, because my marginal propensity to consume is absolutely zero. So that's not going to increase output again. Okay? So that's essentially the deal. Yeah, I think that's fairly okay. All right. I think that's all for today. I have to go make dinner now, but I hope that was useful for you guys. Take a look at week 4 and week 5 in particular for this assignment. It's much more useful. And yeah, hopefully you guys have a good time. See ya.